"You don't belong on that bench, you Constitution-loving bitch," Detective Keith Harrison screamed, before hurling the judge's gavel directly at Judge Iris Beaumont's face right there in open federal court. But that assault instantly became the beginning of the end for a career built on lies and murder. This wasn't just an attack on a black judge, it was the moment someone finally pushed too far in front of the wrong person. Harrison had no idea the woman he just attacked had been quietly reviewing habeas corpus evidence that certain people desperately wanted to stay buried forever, including video footage about a case that destroyed families and covered up the execution of a black teenager. What started as a routine constitutional hearing became the spark that would ignite a federal investigation exposing corruption at the highest levels. Watch till the end, because this time when the system tried to protect its own killer cops, the whole foundation cracked, and what came next changed everything for those who thought murdering black children was acceptable. The morning sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of Courtroom 5B in the Denver Federal District Court, where the mahogany benches had witnessed decades of constitutional battles that shaped the very foundation of civil rights in America. But this Wednesday morning would be different. This would be the day when 15 years of systematic injustice would finally explode in the face of someone who had the power to fight back. Judge Iris Beaumont adjusted her reading glasses as she reviewed the habeas corpus petition that had been keeping her awake for 4 nights straight. The document in her hands bore the desperate signature of Zaria Coleman, a mother whose 16-year-old son had been sitting in Denver County Jail for 8 months on charges that made no legal sense under any interpretation of Colorado law. The petition described Jude Coleman, honor roll student at East High School, arrested for conspiracy to commit aggravated assault on a police officer and possession of evidence indicating gang affiliation. But Judge Beaumont had learned to read between the lines of police reports, especially those bearing the signature of Detective Keith Harrison. At 46 years old, with 19 years of constitutional law experience, she had developed an instinct for recognizing patterns that others preferred to ignore. Jude sat in the defendant's chair wearing the orange jumpsuit that had become his uniform for the past 8 months, his hands shackled despite posing no threat to anyone in the courtroom. At 16, he carried himself with the careful dignity of a young man who had learned that survival in the system often depended on making himself as small and non-threatening as possible, even when demanding his constitutional rights. His mother, Zaria Coleman, sat in the front row clutching a manila folder containing straight-A report cards, letters of recommendation from teachers, and documentation of her son's acceptance to 3 different colleges, evidence of a future that Detective Harrison had stolen with fabricated charges and perjured testimony. Wait until you see what Harrison says when he realizes who he's really dealing with. The courtroom door burst open with the force of someone who had never been denied entry anywhere, the brass hinges protesting under Detective Keith Harrison's aggressive entrance. At 6'3", with the solid build of a former Marine, Harrison filled the doorway like a man stepping onto territory he owned, rather than a public servant appearing before constitutional authority. His dark blue uniform bore commendations and service ribbons that told the story of 15 years climbing through department ranks. But Judge Beaumont noticed details that others missed: the way his hand rested on his weapon during civil proceedings, the calculating sweep of his pale gray eyes as they assessed potential threats to his narrative. When Harrison's gaze met Judge Beaumont's, something flickered across his expression that she recognized from decades of watching men assert dominance in her courtroom. Not quite disrespect, not yet, but the subtle dismissiveness of someone who viewed black women in positions of authority as temporary obstacles rather than legitimate constitutional officers. "Your Honor," Harrison said, settling into the witness chair with casual ownership, "I appreciate the court taking time for this matter, but I want to assure you that Jude Coleman's arrest and detention were conducted according to strict departmental protocol and federal guidelines for gang-related activities." Judge Beaumont observed this performance with the steady composure of someone who had spent decades watching officers transform legal proceedings into personal theater. She had seen Harrison's type before, men who confused badges with crowns and forgot that constitutional authority flowed from the people, not from the government. But what Harrison didn't know What he couldn't possibly have suspected as he began weaving his familiar web of lies and half-truths was that Judge Beaumont had been building a federal case against him for 6 months. Hidden in her secure files was evidence that would destroy not just his career, but the entire network of corruption that had protected his crimes throughout his rise to power. His next words are going to shock you beyond belief. The silence in Courtroom 5B felt different this morning, charged with the kind of tension that preceded constitutional reckonings. Harrison arranged himself in the witness chair like a king holding court, completely unaware that he was about to provide testimony that would send him to federal prison for the rest of his life. "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had learned to command respect through competence rather than intimidation. "Please explain to this court the specific evidence that justified holding Jude Coleman without bail for 8 months on charges that appear to lack constitutional foundation." What Harrison revealed next would prove that Jude Coleman was just his latest victim in a pattern of racist violence that had been protected by institutional silence for far too long. Harrison leaned back slightly in the witness chair, a gesture that would have been subtle if not for the constitutional context. In a federal courtroom, where respect for judicial authority was foundational to the entire system of government, even small displays of casual disregard carried significant weight. "Your Honor," Harrison began, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone who had testified in similar hearings dozens of times without serious challenge. "Jude Coleman was arrested during a comprehensive anti-gang operation targeting known criminal networks in the East Denver area. Based on intelligence gathered over several months, we identified patterns of behavior consistent with gang recruitment and initiation activities." Judge Beaumont made careful notes, her pen moving deliberately across the legal pad while her mind processed the familiar euphemisms. Anti-gang operation was Harrison's preferred term for what community observers described as systematic harassment of black teenagers who had committed no crime beyond existing in neighborhoods where Harrison had decided they didn't belong. "Detective Harrison, what specific intelligence led to Mr. Coleman's identification as a target of this operation?" For the first time, Harrison's confident demeanor flickered slightly. He glanced toward the prosecutor's table, perhaps expecting support that wasn't forthcoming, before returning his attention to Judge Beaumont. "Your Honor, Coleman was observed engaging in suspicious behavior patterns consistent with criminal organization lookout activities. He was frequently present in areas known for drug trafficking and gang recruitment." Judge Beaumont consulted her case files with practiced precision. According to the arrest report, Mr. Coleman was waiting for the RTD bus at the intersection of Colfax and Federal at 7:15 a.m. on a school morning. "Are you testifying that waiting for public transportation constitutes suspicious gang behavior?" The question dropped into the courtroom like a stone into still water. Harrison's hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of the witness chair, tightened into fists as he struggled to maintain his narrative in the face of basic logical scrutiny. But this wasn't Harrison's first time targeting black teens, and Judge Beaumont knew it. In her private chambers the previous evening, Judge Beaumont had spread Harrison's case files across her desk like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. The pattern was undeniable. 23 arrests in the past 2 years, 22 involving black teenagers, all charged with variations of gang-related activity or conspiracy to commit violent crimes. Marcus Washington, 17, arrested for displaying gang colors while wearing his high school's red and black football jersey. Destiny Parker, 15, charged with criminal association for walking with her cousin, who had been previously arrested by Harrison. Trevor Mitchell, 14 years old, detained for aggressive posturing after asking Harrison why he was being stopped while walking home from the library. Each case had been plea bargained down or dismissed on technicalities, ensuring that Harrison's methods never faced serious constitutional scrutiny in appellate courts. But there was one name that appeared in Harrison's files that made Judge Beaumont's blood run cold. Jude's older brother, Marcus Coleman, 17 years old, shot and killed during what Harrison described as a justified use of deadly force. What she found in those files would shock you. "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont continued, consulting her notes with deliberate precision, You mentioned intelligence gathering over several months. Can you provide this court with documentation of the specific criminal activities that Mr. Coleman was allegedly involved in? Harrison's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Your Honor, much of our intelligence comes from confidential informants and surveillance operations that could be compromised if disclosed in open court. However, I can assure the court that Coleman's behavior patterns were consistent with known gang recruitment methodologies. The answer revealed more than Harrison intended, exposing a law enforcement philosophy where suspicion justified detention and speculation replaced evidence. Judge Beaumont had heard variations of this reasoning before, usually from officers who viewed constitutional protections as obstacles to efficient policing rather than the foundation of legitimate government authority. Behind her calm exterior, Judge Beaumont's mind was racing through the implications of Harrison's testimony. She had spent the previous weekend reviewing not just his arrest records, but the broader statistics from his precinct operations. The numbers painted a disturbing picture. Black teenagers in Harrison's patrol area were arrested at rates 11 times higher than their white counterparts, despite demographic data showing no corresponding difference in actual crime rates. What she found in those files would shock you. The breakthrough had come 2 weeks earlier, when FBI Special Agent Rebecca Torres from the Civil Rights Division had quietly approached Judge Beaumont with concerns about Harrison's pattern of constitutional violations. Torres, a 15-year veteran of federal civil rights enforcement, had been conducting her own investigation after receiving multiple complaints from community organizations about Harrison's targeting of minority youth. Judge Beaumont, Torres had said during their confidential meeting in chambers, "We've been trying to build a federal case against Harrison for 18 months, but every time we get close, local evidence disappears or witnesses become reluctant to testify. There's something you need to see." The envelope Torres had given her contained evidence that would prove Jude Coleman's imprisonment was just the tip of an iceberg that included systematic murder, evidence fabrication, and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of Colorado law enforcement. The manila envelope Agent Torres had handed Judge Beaumont contained photocopied documents that should never have left federal custody. Harrison's original incident report from Marcus Coleman's shooting, complete with handwritten notes that had been omitted from the final official version, submitted to Internal Affairs and the District Attorney's Office. The discrepancies were staggering and undeniable. In his initial report, Harrison had written, "Subject appeared to be surrendering when engagement initiated." But the final version stated, "Subject advanced aggressively toward officer position with weapon visible." The original noted, "No weapon recovered at scene during initial sweep." The official report claimed, "Subject's firearm recovered 12 feet from body, consistent with dropping during fall." Most damning of all, Harrison's preliminary notes included the phrase, "Unclear why lethal force was necessary given subject's compliance and obvious fear." Judge Beaumont had read those documents with growing horror, understanding that she was looking at evidence of a cover-up that reached far beyond one officer's mistakes. Someone with significant institutional authority had helped Harrison transform a questionable shooting into a heroic act of self-defense, and that same system was now being used to destroy the victim's younger brother through fabricated charges. Harrison had no idea he was about to confess to something much worse. "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont said, her voice taking on a sharper edge that made several people in the courtroom sit up straighter. "In your 15 years of law enforcement, how many juveniles have you arrested for gang-related offenses?" Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, perhaps surprised by the change in direction, but not yet concerned about the constitutional implications. "I don't keep exact tallies, Your Honor. Probably 80 or 90 cases over the years. Most get resolved through plea agreements. Kids learn from the experience and avoid future criminal involvement." "Of those 80 or 90 cases, what percentage would you estimate involved minority juveniles?" The question dropped into the courtroom like a constitutional bombshell. Harrison's confident expression flickered, and he glanced around the room as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist in a federal court operating under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. "Your Honor, I don't pay attention to race when making arrests. I respond to criminal behavior patterns, not demographics. That's admirable, Detective. But surely you can provide a rough estimate for the court's statistical analysis. Half. 3/4. Harrison's hands clenched into fists as he realized the constitutional trap being constructed around his testimony. Your Honor, I patrol areas with diverse demographics. My arrests naturally reflect the population composition of my assigned territory. Judge Beaumont consulted her files with deliberate precision. According to recent census data, your patrol area is 42% black, 31% Hispanic, and 27% white. Would you testify under oath that your juvenile arrests reflect that demographic breakdown? The mathematical precision of the question left no room for deflection or constitutional evasion. Harrison's face had gone pale, and when he spoke, his voice carried an edge of desperation that revealed his understanding that his testimony was creating an unwinnable constitutional case. His next words revealed everything. Your Honor, with respect, I don't think racial statistics are relevant to this specific habeas corpus petition. We're here about one individual case involving one specific defendant who engaged in documented criminal behavior. Judge Beaumont leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Harrison's increasingly uncomfortable face. Actually, Detective Harrison, pattern of discriminatory enforcement is absolutely relevant to constitutional analysis under both the 4th and 14th Amendments. When an officer's arrest record shows extreme racial disparities, it raises fundamental questions about equal protection and selective enforcement. Harrison's composure was beginning to crack, revealing the anger that always lurked beneath his professional facade. Your Honor, with due respect, I've served this community faithfully for 15 years. I've put my life on the line to protect citizens, including citizens who look like you. The phrase, citizens who look like you, hit the courtroom like a verbal explosion. Judge Beaumont felt the collective intake of breath from the gallery, the sharp shock of witnessing someone cross a constitutional line that should have been inviolate. But she also felt something else rising inside her, not anger, but the cold, crystalline clarity that came when someone revealed their true nature so completely that pretense became impossible. Detective Harrison, Judge Beaumont said, rising slowly from her chair, your service record is not being questioned. Your methods, your judgment, and your apparent belief that a citizen's race determines their constitutional rights, those are being questioned, and rightfully so under federal civil rights law. Harrison stood as well, his height making him tower over the judicial bench in a way that felt deliberately intimidating. But everyone in the courtroom understood that true authority in this space came not from physical presence, but from constitutional legitimacy. But Harrison had no idea that Judge Beaumont possessed audio recordings that would expose not just his racism, but his confession to murdering Jude's brother and his plans to eliminate potential witnesses. Judge Beaumont had spent 3 sleepless nights listening to the audio recordings that Agent Torres had provided, each conversation revealing another layer of institutional corruption that made Harrison's individual crimes seem almost insignificant compared to the system that had protected and enabled them. The first recording captured Harrison discussing Marcus Coleman's shooting with his immediate supervisor, Lieutenant David Cross, in what sounded like a bar setting, with background noise of clinking glasses and muted conversations. Harrison's voice was slightly slurred, but unmistakably discussing the deliberate execution of a 17-year-old boy. The problem with these kids, Dave, is they think constitutional rights apply to them the same way they apply to real Americans, Harrison's recorded voice had said with chilling casualness. That Coleman boy kept talking about his rights, about wanting to call his mother, about being innocent. Made me sick. Lieutenant Cross's response was equally damning. Sometimes you have to teach lessons that stick, Keith. One dead gang member prevents 10 future victims. The community should thank you instead of filing complaints. Harrison's laugh echoed through Judge Beaumont's chambers with bone-chilling cruelty. Oh, they'll learn. Already started working on his little brother. Kid thinks he's going to college, but I'm going to teach him what happens to families that don't show proper respect. His reaction when he heard his own voice was priceless. Detective Harrison, Judge Beaumont said, consulting another section of her evidence folder, I'd like to discuss your encounter with Marcus Coleman on September 12th of last year. Do you recall that incident? Harrison's face went white at the mention of Marcus Coleman's name, understanding for the first time that his carefully buried secrets were about to be dragged into constitutional daylight. Your Honor, that case was thoroughly investigated by Internal Affairs, the District Attorney's Office, and an independent review board. I was cleared of any wrongdoing and received a commendation for heroism in the line of duty. Yes, the official reports do paint you as quite the hero, Judge Beaumont agreed, pulling out a document and holding it up for the courtroom to see. According to this final incident report, Marcus Coleman was an armed gang member who threatened your life, forcing you to use deadly force in self-defense. Harrison nodded eagerly, perhaps thinking he was being offered a constitutional lifeline. That's absolutely correct, Your Honor. The subject was reaching for a weapon when I discharged my firearm. It was a textbook defensive shooting under department policy. Judge Beaumont set the official report aside and picked up another document, this one bearing Harrison's handwriting and original timestamps that proved its authenticity beyond any reasonable doubt. That's interesting, Detective, because your initial incident report tells a very different story about constitutional violations. The audio they tried to destroy was about to surface. Your Honor, I don't know what document you're holding, but if it contradicts the official findings of multiple review boards, this is your original incident report, Detective Harrison, filed electronically at 10:23 p.m. on September 12th, exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes after you shot Marcus Coleman. Judge Beaumont's voice carried the precision of someone who had spent months verifying every constitutional detail. Would you like me to read your initial observations to the court? Harrison's hands were trembling now, his earlier swagger completely evaporated. He understood that whatever was in that document would destroy the carefully constructed narrative that had protected him for over a year from federal civil rights prosecution. Subject was running away with hands visible when engagement began, Judge Beaumont read aloud, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. No weapon observed at time of first shot. Subject fell immediately and did not move after impact. Unknown why lethal force was initiated. The words hit the courtroom like constitutional thunder. In the gallery, several observers gasped audibly as they processed the implications of Harrison's own documentation. Marcus Coleman hadn't been threatening Harrison. He had been running away when Harrison shot him in the back in clear violation of the Fourth Amendment's prohibition against unreasonable seizure. Judge Beaumont continued reading from Harrison's original report. Subject was approximately 20 feet away and moving away from officer position when shots were fired. No weapon recovered during initial scene security. Subject appeared to be attempting to surrender when engagement began. Harrison tried to interrupt, his voice cracking with desperation. Those are preliminary observations made under extreme stress. The official investigation determined that the subject posed an imminent threat. The official investigation was a cover-up, Judge Beaumont said quietly, but her words carried absolute constitutional authority. And you're about to discover exactly how extensive that conspiracy was. She gestured to her court administrator, who had been setting up audiovisual equipment with practiced efficiency. What the court is about to hear is a recording of Detective Harrison discussing his deliberate murder of Marcus Coleman and his plans to frame Marcus's younger brother as revenge against the family for seeking justice. The courtroom's speakers crackled to life with voices that were immediately recognizable as Harrison and Lieutenant Cross, recorded in what federal investigators had identified as Murphy's Tavern on East Colfax, a known gathering place for Denver Police Department personnel who preferred to discuss sensitive matters away from official scrutiny. Harrison's recorded voice filled the constitutional silence. You should have seen the look on that Coleman kid's face when he realized I wasn't going to let him run home to Mama. 17 years old and still believed the Constitution was going to protect him from reality. Lieutenant Cross's harsh laugh provided the backdrop for Harrison's next confession. These families need to understand that filing complaints has consequences. You can't have gang members' relatives thinking they can challenge police authority without paying a price. Harrison's voice continued with chilling pride. That's exactly why I'm working on the little brother now. Jude thinks he's going to college, thinks his good grades and clean record matter, but I'm teaching him what happens when your family doesn't show proper respect for law enforcement. The current Harrison sitting in the witness chair had gone completely pale, sweat beading on his forehead despite the courtroom's controlled temperature. His mouth moved soundlessly as he listened to his own voice confessing to constitutional violations that carried federal penalties up to and including life imprisonment. But wait, there's more evidence you haven't seen yet. The recording continued with Lieutenant Cross, providing specific instructions on evidence manipulation. The key is making sure the paperwork tells the right story from the beginning. As long as the reports show imminent threat and justified response, internal affairs will back us up every time. Harrison's recorded response revealed the systematic nature of the constitutional violations. I've been using that exact approach for 5 years now. The beauty is that once a kid has any kind of record, you can justify almost anything. Traffic stops, searches, arrests, even shootings if necessary. Judge Beaumont watched Harrison's face cycle through expressions of panic, desperation, and finally cold calculation as he realized that his private confessions had been preserved for federal prosecution. The confident officer who had entered her courtroom was being replaced by a desperate criminal, watching his entire world of constitutional violations collapse in real time. "Where did you get that recording?" Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible above the courtroom's ventilation system. "Someone who couldn't live with the conspiracy of silence anymore," Judge Beaumont replied with constitutional precision. "Someone who understood that protecting murderers makes you an accessory to federal crimes." The recording wasn't finished. Cross's voice continued with administrative details about evidence destruction. "Make sure the body camera footage gets corrupted during processing. Technical difficulties happen all the time, especially with older equipment." Harrison's laugh echoed through the speakers with stomach-turning casualness. "Already handled. The footage shows exactly what we need it to show. Subject reaching toward waistband, aggressive posturing, failure to comply with lawful commands, same template that's worked dozens of times before." His reaction when he realized the scope was priceless. Harrison realized that his secret thoughts had been documented and preserved, that his casual discussions of murder and evidence tampering were now part of the federal record. His earlier bluster and constitutional defiance had evaporated, replaced by the hollow look of a man watching his entire career built on systematic rights violations collapse. "Your Honor," Harrison said desperately, "those conversations were taken out of context. Officers sometimes use dark humor to cope with the stress of dangerous assignments." "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont interrupted, "we just heard you and your supervisor celebrating the murder of a 17-year-old boy and planning to frame his younger brother as retaliation against a family seeking constitutional justice. There is no context that makes federal civil rights violations acceptable." The weight of Harrison's exposed crimes hung over the courtroom like toxic smoke. Judge Beaumont could see faces in the gallery that reflected shock, horror, and something deeper, the recognition that they had witnessed the mask being stripped away from institutional racism to reveal the criminal conspiracy beneath. But Judge Beaumont wasn't finished with Harrison yet. Hidden in her evidence folder was documentation that would prove Harrison's crimes extended far beyond individual constitutional violations to include racketeering, conspiracy, and systematic deprivation of civil rights under color of law. But the judge wasn't done with him yet. As Harrison slumped in the witness chair, Judge Beaumont prepared to reveal evidence that would demonstrate his individual crimes were part of a larger criminal enterprise that had been systematically violating the constitutional rights of minority youth for over a decade, with official protection and institutional support. What Harrison was about to discover was that Judge Beaumont had been working with federal investigators for months, and everything he had said under oath was being transmitted directly to FBI agents who were already executing arrest warrants for his entire network of co-conspirators. Judge Beaumont opened another section of her evidence folder, revealing documents that bore official FBI letterhead and federal grand jury seals. Harrison's eyes widened as he recognized federal law enforcement insignia, understanding for the first time that his constitutional violations had attracted attention far beyond the local courthouse. "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont said, "what you don't seem to understand is that this habeas corpus hearing stopped being about Jude Coleman the moment you confessed to murdering Marcus Coleman under color of law. Federal authorities have been monitoring this proceeding based on evidence that was brought to their attention months ago. As if summoned by her words, the courtroom's rear doors opened to admit 4 individuals in dark suits, their movements precise and purposeful. The lead figure, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, approached the bench with credentials already in hand. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Rebecca Torres with the FBI's Civil Rights Division. We have federal warrants for Detective Harrison's arrest on charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, conspiracy to commit murder, and systematic violation of civil rights." Harrison looked around the courtroom with wild eyes, perhaps only now understanding that his constitutional violations had been witnessed not just by local court personnel, but by federal law enforcement officials who had been building a RICO case against him for months. "This is impossible," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Internal Affairs cleared me. The DA's office reviewed every case. I followed department protocol to the letter." Agent Torres approached Harrison with handcuffs, her expression professionally neutral, but her intent unmistakable. "Detective Keith Harrison, you are under federal arrest for violations of Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code. You have the right to remain silent under the Fifth Amendment." "You won't believe what they captured on tape." As Agent Torres continued reading Harrison his constitutional rights, Judge Beaumont realized there was one more piece of evidence that needed to be revealed before federal authorities processed his arrest. The audio recording they had just heard was damning enough to secure multiple life sentences, but there was another conversation that would expose the full scope of the criminal enterprise. "Agent Torres," Judge Beaumont said, "before you process Detective Harrison's federal arrest, there's additional evidence that your RICO investigation needs to hear. Evidence that reveals this conspiracy extends to the highest levels of Colorado law enforcement." Harrison's face went from pale to gray as Judge Beaumont gestured for her court administrator to load another audio file. His desperate attempts to maintain innocence had been shattered by his own recorded confessions, but what was about to be played would destroy any hope of claiming his actions were individual aberrations rather than institutional policy. "What the court is about to hear," Judge Beaumont announced, "is a recording of Detective Harrison discussing his methods with Police Chief William Patterson, the commanding officer of the Denver Police Department. This conversation took place 4 months ago at the annual Police Benevolent Association conference. If you believe that young people like Jude Coleman deserve constitutional protection from corrupt officers, type justice below." The speakers filled with the sound of a crowded conference room, multiple conversations creating a backdrop of administrative noise. Harrison's voice emerged clearly, slightly intoxicated, but unmistakably discussing his approach to constitutional law enforcement with the Chief of Police. "Chief Patterson," Harrison's recorded voice said, "I want to thank you for backing me up on the Coleman shooting. Some of the community leaders have been asking questions about my constitutional methods, and it's reassuring to know that Command supports proactive policing." Patterson's gravelly voice responded with casual authority that revealed the institutional nature of the conspiracy. "Keith, you do what needs to be done to maintain order in these communities. The public doesn't understand the reality of urban law enforcement. Sometimes constitutional niceties have to take a back seat to public safety." Harrison's current reaction in the courtroom was a study in psychological collapse. His face had gone from gray to green, understanding that his private conversations with the city's highest law enforcement official were now part of a federal criminal investigation that could result in RICO prosecutions reaching the mayor's office. "Wait until you see what happened to the other officers." The recording continued with Patterson providing specific guidance on avoiding federal civil rights prosecutions. "The key is documentation that supports threat assessment and imminent danger findings. As long as your reports use the right constitutional language, federal prosecutors will have difficulty proving discriminatory intent." Harrison's recorded voice expressed gratitude for the criminal guidance. "That's exactly what Lieutenant Cross taught me. We've developed standardized language that works for almost any situation: aggressive posturing, failure to comply, reasonable fear for officer safety. It's impossible for civil rights attorneys to prove what someone's real intent was." The conversation revealed a systematic approach to circumventing constitutional protections, but what Harrison was about to hear next would prove that his individual crimes were part of a statewide network of police corruption that included evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and the systematic elimination of constitutional rights for minority youth. The federal investigation's scope expanded in real time, as the recordings revealed connections between Harrison's individual crimes and a statewide network of officers who shared intelligence, coordinated responses to civil rights complaints, and provided mutual protection from constitutional accountability. Agent Torres had stopped reading Harrison his rights, understanding that the evidence being revealed would fundamentally change the scope of her investigation from individual civil rights violations to a massive RICO conspiracy involving dozens of law enforcement officials across multiple jurisdictions. The recording continued with Chief Patterson revealing the institutional support structure. We've been working with chiefs in Boulder, Colorado Springs, and Grand Junction to share information about problem families and activist attorneys. When someone files federal civil rights complaints, we make sure their name gets circulated to departments statewide. Harrison's recorded response exposed the systematic nature of the retaliation. That's brilliant, Chief. We've been using that network to track the Coleman family's movements since they hired that civil rights attorney. Every traffic stop, every interaction with any family member gets documented and shared. Judge Beaumont felt a cold satisfaction as she watched the constitutional foundations of Harrison's criminal enterprise crumble in real time. This wasn't just about one corrupt officer. It was about dismantling a statewide conspiracy that had systematically violated the civil rights of minority families for years. What they discovered in the files will shock you. Agent Torres's radio crackled with updates from other federal teams executing simultaneous operations across Colorado. Command, we have Chief Patterson in custody at his residence. Lieutenant Cross is barricaded in his office but contained. We've seized approximately 600 case files and 23 computer servers from 4 different police stations. The RICO operation's scope was staggering. This wasn't just about Harrison's individual constitutional violations, but about dismantling an entire network of corrupt officers who had been systematically abusing their authority while enjoying administrative protection and institutional support. Harrison was hauled to his feet by federal marshals, his face cycling between rage and panic as the reality of his situation became undeniable under federal law. This is all because of one punk gang member. Everything was constitutional until you people started stirring up civil rights trouble. Judge Beaumont felt a cold satisfaction as she watched Harrison's worldview crumble in real time. For 15 years, he had terrorized minority youth with the confidence that the system would protect him from constitutional accountability. Now that same system was turning against him with the full force of federal civil rights law. The best part is coming up. The recording wasn't finished. Patterson's voice continued with details about evidence destruction protocols. Make sure any body camera footage that contradicts officer testimony gets corrupted during the digital transfer process. We have technicians who specialize in creating plausible equipment malfunctions. Harrison's laugh echoed through the constitutional silence with nauseating pride. We've perfected that system over 5 years of federal oversight. The beauty is that technical failures are completely believable. Old equipment, software glitches, user error. Civil rights attorneys can't prove intentional destruction. The systematic nature of the constitutional violations was breathtaking in its scope and sophistication. This wasn't opportunistic corruption. It was a carefully designed system for circumventing federal civil rights law while maintaining plausible deniability for institutional review. Wait until you see what she captured on tape. But the most devastating revelation came in Patterson's next statement. The federal oversight period ends in 18 months. After that, we'll have even more flexibility to handle problem families and activist communities without Washington interference. Harrison's response revealed the long-term planning behind their constitutional crimes. I've already started working on a list of families and individuals who need attitude adjustments once federal scrutiny decreases. The Coleman family is at the top of that list. Judge Beaumont understood that she was listening to evidence of a criminal conspiracy that went far beyond individual rights violations to include planned intimidation, evidence destruction, and systematic retaliation against citizens who sought constitutional protection from police misconduct. The weight of institutional criminality hung over the courtroom like toxic smoke, making every breath feel dangerous and corrupted. Harrison had been led away in federal custody, but the recordings continued to reveal a network of constitutional violations that reached into every corner of Colorado law enforcement. But what Judge Beaumont was about to reveal next would prove that Harrison's network had been systematically murdering black teenagers across 3 states, with each killing covered up by the same evidence-tampering protocols they had just heard described in detail. Agent Torres had established a command center in the courthouse's conference room, coordinating arrests while reviewing evidence that had been accumulating for over a year through federal surveillance operations. Judge Beaumont joined the briefing, still bearing the weight of constitutional revelations that seemed to expand with each piece of evidence. "Your Honor," Agent Torres said, spreading photographs and documents across the conference table, "Harrison's recorded confessions have given us probable cause for RICO prosecutions involving 47 officers across Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico. But what we're about to show you reveals that systematic murder was their primary method of control." The photographs showed crime scenes that bore Harrison's signature methodology: young black men shot while running away, weapons planted near bodies, incident reports that described imminent threats, where surveillance footage showed clear surrender attempts. Each case had been ruled justified by local review boards using the same constitutional language Patterson had described in his recorded instructions. One file contained body camera footage that had been corrupted during official processing, but preserved by federal investigators through court orders. The video showed Officer Daniel Murphy, one of Harrison's protégés, executing 18-year-old Damon Rodriguez during a traffic stop in Boulder. Rodriguez had his hands on the steering wheel, clearly visible and empty, when Murphy shot him through the driver's side window. Murphy's radio transmission immediately after the shooting demonstrated the systematic nature of the cover-up. Shots fired, officer safety situation. Subject reached for weapon during traffic stop. Requesting supervisor and crime scene unit. But the body camera footage showed Rodriguez never moved his hands from the steering wheel, never reached for anything, and spent his final moments begging Murphy not to shoot him while complying with every command. Justice was finally coming for everyone involved. The federal investigation had identified a pattern of constitutional violations that extended across state lines through informal networks of police trainers and consultants. Harrison's methods had been shared through law enforcement conferences and training seminars, spreading his approach to systematic rights violations across the Mountain West region. Judge Beaumont reviewed evidence showing that Harrison had received over $300,000 in speaking fees and consulting payments for teaching other departments his techniques for proactive community policing and gang prevention strategies. His systematic terrorization of minority youth had become a profitable business model that incentivized the destruction of constitutional rights for personal financial gain. 3 weeks after Harrison's arrest, the Department of Justice announced the largest federal civil rights investigation in decades, encompassing 19 police departments and involving over 400 officers who had either participated in or enabled systematic abuse of minority youth under color of law. The scope of this corruption will blow your mind. Attorney General Maria Santos held a press conference announcing the formation of a federal task force with unlimited resources and RICO authority. What we have uncovered in Colorado represents a betrayal of every constitutional principle that law enforcement is supposed to uphold, she declared. This investigation will follow the evidence wherever it leads, regardless of rank, political connections, or institutional resistance. The task force's first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source: police department computer servers that had automatically backed up deleted files to cloud storage systems that administrators didn't know existed. Months of accumulated digital evidence revealed hundreds of text messages and emails, coordinating constitutional violations while discussing techniques for avoiding federal prosecution. One particularly damaging message thread showed Harrison coordinating with officers in New Mexico to eliminate Marcus Coleman as a potential witness in a federal investigation. The messages revealed that Marcus hadn't been killed during a routine traffic stop. He had been specifically targeted and executed because his family had hired civil rights attorneys to investigate Harrison's pattern of constitutional violations. What they discovered in the secret communications will shock you. The investigation revealed that Harrison had been operating as part of a criminal enterprise that included prosecutors, judges, and police administrators who coordinated responses to civil rights complaints and shared intelligence about problem families who might document constitutional violations. Text messages showed Assistant District Attorney Patricia Wells warning Harrison about federal investigations. Civil Rights Division asking questions about your arrest patterns. Recommend reducing minority contact for next few months until heat dies down. Harrison's response revealed the systematic nature of the constitutional violations, already coordinated with Boulder and Grand Junction. We'll shift operations to rural areas where federal oversight is lighter. Same results, less federal attention. These messages proved that Harrison's individual crimes were part of a larger criminal organization that had used law enforcement positions to systematically violate the constitutional rights of minority citizens while coordinating with prosecutors and judges to avoid accountability. But wait, there's more evidence you haven't seen yet. Financial audits revealed that several officers had been receiving payments from private security companies and bail bond businesses in exchange for generating arrests in specific neighborhoods. Harrison alone had received over $400,000 in undisclosed payments over 7 years, essentially being paid by private interests to criminalize minority youth in violation of their constitutional rights. Court documents showed that Harrison had agreements with 5 different private companies that profited from high arrest rates in minority communities. His systematic targeting of black teenagers wasn't just unconstitutional, it was also a lucrative criminal enterprise that incentivized him to destroy young lives for personal financial gain in direct violation of federal civil rights law. But Judge Beaumont was about to discover that Harrison's most dangerous crime wasn't murder or conspiracy. It was his plan to eliminate her as a witness, a plan that was already in motion and would culminate in the violent assault that federal agents were secretly recording to complete their RICO case. The constitutional moment that would define Judge Beaumont's legacy was approaching with the inevitability of natural law. Harrison had been returned to the witness stand under federal guard, his earlier confidence replaced by the desperate calculation of someone who understood that his freedom, and possibly his life, depended on silencing the one person who could complete the federal case against his criminal enterprise. Judge Beaumont had spent the recess reviewing additional evidence that Agent Torres had provided, wiretapped conversations proving that Harrison's network had been planning to eliminate her as a witness through what they termed an unfortunate accident that would look like random urban violence. The plan was sophisticated and chilling in its constitutional implications. Harrison's recorded voice discussed hiring gang members to assault Judge Beaumont in the courthouse parking garage, making her death appear to be retaliation from defendants she had sentenced rather than witness elimination by corrupt police officers. But federal investigators had been one step ahead, installing surveillance equipment throughout the courthouse and positioning undercover agents to document Harrison's final criminal act, the violent assault that would complete the evidence needed for federal RICO prosecutions carrying life sentences. Wait until you see what Crawford says when he realizes who he's really dealing with. Detective Harrison, Judge Beaumont said as the hearing resumed, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone who had spent decades protecting constitutional rights from exactly this kind of institutional corruption. You've heard substantial evidence today regarding systematic civil rights violations. Do you have any response to these federal allegations? Harrison's face had taken on the flat, dangerous expression of someone who had moved beyond legal defense to direct threat elimination. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of someone who had decided that constitutional niceties were obstacles to be eliminated through violence. Your Honor, what I've heard today is a coordinated attack on law enforcement by people who don't understand what it takes to maintain order in communities that have rejected civilized behavior. The phrase revealed Harrison's fundamental worldview, that constitutional rights were privileges to be granted or withheld based on his personal assessment of who deserved civilized treatment. Judge Beaumont recognized the language of authoritarianism disguised as law enforcement philosophy. Detective Harrison, are you suggesting that constitutional protections should be applied selectively based on community characteristics? Harrison's response crossed every line of judicial respect and constitutional authority. I'm suggesting that people who don't respect law and order shouldn't expect the same protections as law-abiding citizens. And judges who enable criminal behavior by hiding behind constitutional technicalities are part of the problem. His next words revealed everything. The courtroom fell silent, as everyone present understood that Harrison had just threatened a federal judge while under oath and in the presence of FBI agents. Judge Beaumont felt the familiar clarity that came when someone revealed their true nature so completely that all pretense became impossible. "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont said, rising slowly from her chair, "constitutional rights are not technicalities. They are the foundation of legitimate government authority. Your apparent belief that badges grant immunity from constitutional law is exactly why this federal investigation was necessary." Harrison stood as well, his movement aggressive and deliberately intimidating. At 6'3" with tactical training, he towered over Judge Beaumont's slight frame, but everyone in the courtroom understood that moral authority transcended physical presence in spaces governed by constitutional law. "You want to talk about authority?" Harrison snarled, his voice rising to a level that made several observers shift nervously. "I've been protecting this community while you sit in your ivory tower making legal decisions that get people killed on the streets." Judge Beaumont remained composed despite the obvious threat in Harrison's demeanor. "Detective Harrison, protecting the community means protecting everyone's constitutional rights, not selecting which citizens deserve legal protection based on personal prejudice." Harrison's face flushed with barely controlled rage. "You people always twist everything into race issues when it's about respect for authority. It's about understanding that some communities need stronger law enforcement because they can't govern themselves peacefully." Crawford had no idea he was about to confess to something much worse. The phrase "you people" sealed Harrison's fate in terms of federal civil rights prosecution, but Judge Beaumont knew from federal briefings that he was building toward the violent assault that would complete the RICO case. Hidden cameras were recording every word and movement for federal prosecutors who needed evidence of Harrison's willingness to use violence against constitutional authority. "You know what your real problem is," Harrison continued, taking a step toward the bench with obvious menace. "You think wearing judicial robes changes what you really are, but I know what you are underneath all that legal pretense, and I know how to deal with people like you." The silence that followed was electric with constitutional tension, everyone in the courtroom understanding that they were about to witness something that would change the fundamental relationship between law enforcement and judicial authority. Harrison reached for the judicial gavel with the intent to use it as a weapon, not understanding that federal agents were recording his every movement and that his assault would provide the final evidence needed to dismantle the largest police corruption network in American history. The moment that would be studied in constitutional law classes for generations was building with the terrible momentum of historical inevitability. Harrison's hand moved toward the judicial gavel with the calculated precision of someone who had committed violence so often that it had become his instinctive response to challenges to his authority. Judge Beaumont observed his movement with the steady composure of someone who had spent her career refusing to be intimidated by men who confused physical dominance with legitimate power. She had reviewed federal briefings explaining that Harrison's assault would complete the evidence needed for RICO prosecutions, but she also understood that her response would determine whether constitutional authority would be preserved or surrendered to authoritarian violence. Federal agents positioned throughout the courtroom tensed for action, but their instructions were clear: document the assault without intervention unless Judge Beaumont's life was in immediate danger. The constitutional implications required that Harrison's attack be recorded in its entirety to demonstrate his complete rejection of judicial authority and legal process. Harrison's fingers closed around the polished wooden gavel, his movement deliberate and threatening. "Judge Beaumont," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtroom, "it's time someone taught you the difference between legal theory and real-world consequences. These stories of constitutional courage inspire people all around the world. Let us know what country and city you're watching from so we can see how far these powerful messages about judicial authority are reaching." "Detective Harrison," Judge Beaumont replied, her voice maintaining perfect judicial composure despite understanding that she was about to be physically assaulted by someone whose violence had already destroyed multiple families. "The only lesson being taught here is that constitutional law will always prevail over authoritarian violence, regardless of the personal cost to those who uphold it." Harrison's response was to lift the gavel above his head, with obvious intent to use it as a weapon. The symbolism was perfect for federal prosecutors, using the very symbol of judicial authority as an instrument of violence against constitutional process. "You constitutional-loving bitch!" Harrison screamed, his voice echoing off the marble walls with the fury of 15 years of protected criminality finally facing accountability. "I think hiding behind legal precedent protects you from people who understand real power." The gavel flew from Harrison's hand with the force of someone trained in combat techniques, the polished wood spinning through the air toward Judge Beaumont's head with enough velocity to cause serious injury or death. Federal cameras captured every frame of the assault, documenting Harrison's complete rejection of constitutional government and judicial authority. Crack! The gavel struck Judge Beaumont in the center of her forehead, with devastating impact, the sound echoing through the marble courtroom like constitutional thunder. She staggered backward, but remained standing, blood streaming down her face while her judicial robes absorbed the impact of Harrison's violent assault on the rule of law itself. But even as she absorbed Harrison's attack, Judge Beaumont's eyes never closed, her dignity never wavered, her constitutional authority never diminished. She remained upright behind the judicial bench, refusing to give Harrison the satisfaction of seeing constitutional government brought to its knees by authoritarian violence. What he said next crossed every line imaginable. The courtroom erupted in controlled chaos as federal agents moved with practiced precision to subdue Harrison while preserving the evidentiary chain needed for constitutional prosecution. Agent Torres drew her weapon while court security officers approached Harrison from multiple angles, their movements coordinated through prior planning with federal investigators. Harrison stood over the judicial bench like a conqueror surveying conquered territory, his face twisted with savage satisfaction at having expressed his true nature without restraint. "That's what happens when you forget your constitutional place," he snarled, his voice carrying throughout the courtroom despite the organized response surrounding him. But his moment of triumph was brief and historically insignificant. Agent Torres's voice cut through the noise with sharp federal authority. "Keith Harrison, you are under arrest for assault on a federal judicial officer, a felony punishable by up to 30 years in federal prison under Title 18, Section 111 of the United States Code." Federal marshals swarmed Harrison with professional efficiency, wrestling him to the marble floor despite his attempts to resist constitutional authority. The man who had entered the courtroom with swagger and institutional protection was now face down on the courthouse floor, federal handcuffs cutting into his wrists, while dozens of witnesses documented his complete psychological and legal collapse. Judge Beaumont slowly pulled herself upright, her face bearing the mark of Harrison's constitutional assault, but her voice remaining steady when she spoke. "Let the federal record show that Detective Keith Harrison has physically assaulted a sitting federal judge during constitutional proceedings before multiple federal witnesses, demonstrating his complete rejection of legal process and judicial authority." But Harrison's violent assault was only the beginning of the constitutional reckoning. Federal agents were simultaneously executing arrests across 3 states, dismantling the largest police corruption network in American history, while Judge Beaumont's courage inspired similar confrontations with institutional racism nationwide. As Harrison was restrained on the courthouse floor, Agent Torres coordinated with federal teams across the Mountain West through encrypted communications that revealed the stunning scope of the simultaneous operations. Harrison's assault on Judge Beaumont had been the signal for coordinated federal action against an entire network of constitutional criminals who had been operating with impunity for over a decade. "Your Honor," Agent Torres said, approaching the bench while maintaining visual contact with Harrison's prone form, "we've been conducting parallel RICO investigations across Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico for 14 months. What happened here today provides the final evidence we needed to move against his entire criminal enterprise." Judge Beaumont accepted medical attention from federal paramedics, using the moment to compose herself while processing the constitutional implications of Agent Torres's words. The federal investigation had been running concurrently with her own evidence gathering, suggesting a level of coordination that Harrison couldn't have anticipated even in his most paranoid moments. "How extensive is your RICO operation, Agent Torres?" Judge Beaumont asked, her voice steady despite the blood still flowing from Harrison's constitutional assault. Agent Torres gestured toward federal agents entering with briefcases and electronic equipment that suggested operations of massive scope and sophistication. "We have federal warrants for 63 officers across 19 departments, including 4 police chiefs, 12 supervisors, and 7 prosecutors who were part of the criminal conspiracy. We're executing simultaneous raids on 14 police stations, seizing computers, files, and surveillance equipment as evidence of systematic civil rights violations." Harrison lifted his head from the marble floor, his face a mask of disbelief and constitutional terror. "This is impossible. Internal Affairs cleared every case. The Attorney General's office reviewed everything under federal oversight." His reaction when he realized the scope was priceless. Agent Torres looked down at Harrison with professional detachment that carried the weight of federal constitutional authority. "Detective Harrison, our investigation began when Mrs. Zaria Coleman contacted the FBI Civil Rights Division with evidence that local authorities had ignored for over 2 years. She kept copies of everything, including your original incident reports that mysteriously disappeared from police files during internal review. The revelation that Jude Coleman's mother had been working with federal investigators added another layer to Harrison's constitutional nightmare. His carefully constructed cover-up had been unraveling for over a year while he remained oblivious to the federal forces building a RICO case against his entire criminal network. "We also received cooperation from multiple officers within your own department," Agent Torres continued, "who provided documentation showing systematic evidence destruction and witness intimidation. Your supervisor, Lieutenant Cross, is currently being arrested at his residence based on the conspiracy charges revealed in today's recorded confessions." Harrison's psychological collapse accelerated as he realized the full scope of the federal constitutional operation. "You people planned this whole thing. This entire hearing was a setup to destroy legitimate law enforcement." Judge Beaumont stood slowly, her constitutional dignity intact despite Harrison's physical assault. "Detective Harrison, this hearing was about Jude Coleman's right to constitutional protection from false imprisonment. The fact that your own confessions exposed a murder conspiracy was your choice, not federal planning. You won't believe what happens next." Agent Torres's radio crackled with updates from federal teams across 3 states. "Command, we have Chief Patterson in federal custody. Lieutenant Cross attempted to destroy evidence, but contained. We've seized approximately 800 case files, 47 computer servers, and over $2 million in cash from safe deposit boxes registered to conspiracy members." The RICO operation's scope was staggering in its constitutional implications. This wasn't just about Harrison's individual crimes, but about dismantling an entire network of corrupt officers who had been systematically violating civil rights while enjoying institutional protection and federal immunity from prosecution. As Harrison was led away in federal custody, his footsteps echoing through the marble halls, where he had once operated with constitutional impunity, Judge Beaumont understood that they had witnessed something larger than one man's downfall. They had seen federal law finally holding itself accountable to constitutional principles. The best part is coming up. Within hours of Harrison's arrest, the FBI's coordinated RICO operation had resulted in federal charges against 94 law enforcement officials from local police officers to state attorney generals, each facing sentences ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment for systematic violation of civil rights under color of law. Police Chief Patterson was arrested at his suburban home while hosting a dinner party with other municipal officials. The image of him being led away in federal handcuffs becoming the lead story on every national news network as evidence of how deeply constitutional corruption had penetrated American law enforcement. Lieutenant Cross attempted to barricade himself in police headquarters while destroying evidence, feeding documents into industrial shredders until federal agents breached the building and found him surrounded by the shredded remains of files documenting decades of constitutional violations. But the most devastating blow to the constitutional conspiracy came from an unexpected source: Harrison's own body camera footage, which federal investigators had been secretly accessing for months, revealing hundreds of constitutional violations that he had unknowingly documented, while believing his crimes were protected by institutional immunity. 2 years after the gavel that echoed through the halls of constitutional justice, Judge Iris Beaumont received an unexpected visitor in her chambers. Mrs. Zaria Coleman knocked softly on the door, carrying a small wrapped package, and wearing the peaceful expression of someone who had found closure after years of grief and systematic injustice. "Judge Beaumont," Mrs. Coleman said, settling into the chair across from the desk. "I wanted to thank you personally for having the constitutional courage to stand up when it mattered most. Marcus's death finally has meaning because you refused to let Harrison hide behind his badge and institutional protection." The package contained a framed photograph of both Coleman boys at Jude's high school graduation, Marcus smiling with the bright optimism of a young man who believed constitutional protections would keep him safe, and Jude wearing his cap and gown after being released from 8 months of wrongful imprisonment. Beneath the photo was an engraved plaque reading, "Constitutional justice delayed is not justice denied when good people decide to speak truth to federal power." Judge Beaumont felt tears gathering in her eyes as she studied Marcus's face, seeing in his expression the same constitutional hope that she had witnessed in countless young people who had appeared in her courtroom seeking protection from a system that too often failed to uphold their basic rights. The legacy that emerged will inspire generations. The Harrison case had become a watershed moment in American constitutional history, studied in law schools and police academies as an example of how systematic racism operates within institutions and how it can be dismantled through persistent federal enforcement and judicial courage. Judge Beaumont's refusal to be intimidated by Harrison's violence had demonstrated that constitutional law could prevail over authoritarian force when federal authorities committed to upholding civil rights. The federal consent decree governing Colorado law enforcement had become a model for police reform nationwide, with provisions requiring constitutional training, community oversight, and transparent investigation of misconduct complaints under federal supervision. Crime rates in formerly over-policed neighborhoods had actually decreased as community trust in law enforcement was rebuilt through accountability and constitutional respect. Most importantly, young people in Harrison's former patrol area no longer lived in fear of police encounters. The systematic terrorization of minority youth had ended, replaced by community policing models that emphasized constitutional protection rather than authoritarian intimidation. But the most powerful change was invisible yet transformative. Jude Coleman had graduated as valedictorian of his high school class, despite losing 8 months of his senior year to wrongful imprisonment, earning a full scholarship to study constitutional law at Howard University. In his graduation speech, he spoke about the day in Courtroom 5B that had changed his understanding of federal power and constitutional justice. "I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear," Jude said to the packed auditorium. "Constitutional courage is doing what's right, even when the system is designed to punish you for it. Judge Beaumont showed me that one person willing to uphold federal law can change everything." The scholarship fund established in Marcus Coleman's memory had provided educational opportunities for over 300 young people who had been victimized by police misconduct, transforming constitutional trauma into opportunity and ensuring that Harrison's victims could build the futures he had tried to destroy through systematic civil rights violations. Judge Beaumont kept the Coleman family photograph on her desk as a daily reminder that constitutional work, required both legal competence and personal courage. Every case that came before her bench was an opportunity to either perpetuate systematic failures or create space for federal accountability and constitutional healing. The courthouse steps where Mrs. Coleman had once stood alone, demanding constitutional justice for her murdered son, now hosted regular community meetings where residents worked with federal monitors to build trust and prevent the kind of institutional corruption that had flourished in darkness. As evening fell over the courthouse where so much constitutional healing had begun, Judge Beaumont prepared to leave for home, where her husband waited with dinner and stories of his own day, protecting civil rights as a federal prosecutor. The scar from Harrison's gavel assault had faded, but remained visible, a permanent reminder of the moment when she chose constitutional dignity over personal safety. Harrison himself was serving multiple life sentences in federal prison, his days spent in protective custody away from the general population that included many of the young men whose constitutional rights he had systematically violated through false arrests and fabricated charges. His name had become synonymous with police corruption, a cautionary tale taught to every new federal agent about what happened when officers forgot their oath to uphold constitutional law. But Judge Beaumont's legacy was different. Her name was spoken with reverence in communities that had learned to trust the federal justice system again, in law schools where students studied her techniques for confronting institutional racism through constitutional process, and in courtrooms where other judges found courage to challenge corruption rather than enabling it through institutional silence. Some battles are won not through violence, but through the quiet courage of refusing to abandon constitutional principles, when abandonment would be easier. Judge Iris Beaumont had chosen to stay in federal court, and in staying had reminded an entire nation what justice looks like when it refuses to be silenced by authoritarian violence. Harrison's gavel had been intended to silence Judge Beaumont, to put her in her place, as he had put so many others through systematic constitutional violations. Instead, it had become the moment when his entire world of institutional lies and federal crimes collapsed, when the system he had corrupted finally turned against him with the full force of constitutional law. If you're a young person watching this, remember that Jude Coleman was just 16 when he stood up to Harrison's institutional intimidation. If you're a parent, remember that Zaria Coleman never stopped demanding federal justice for her sons. If you're someone in authority, remember that Judge Beaumont could have taken the easy path, but chose to fight for constitutional principles regardless of personal cost. The most important lesson from this story is that constitutional change begins with one person deciding that federal law must be upheld. Harrison thought his badge made him untouchable under constitutional review. He thought his racism would be protected by institutional silence. He thought violence would silence those who challenged his authority through federal process. He was wrong on every count, because he encountered people who understood that constitutional principles are worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. Today, Marcus Coleman's name is engraved on a monument to civil rights heroes outside the Denver Federal Courthouse. Jude Coleman is studying to become a federal civil rights attorney. Mrs. Coleman leads a foundation that provides legal support to families seeking constitutional justice for police misconduct. Judge Beaumont continues her work protecting vulnerable youth from systematic constitutional abuse. And Harrison? He spends his days in a 6x8 federal cell, surrounded by the constitutional consequences of choices that seemed so powerful when he was making them, but proved to be nothing more than the desperate acts of a small man who confused authoritarian cruelty with legitimate governmental strength. Thank you to everyone who typed justice, and to all who shared their locations from around the world. Your global support for constitutional principles means everything. If these stories inspire you, please subscribe to join our community and help us share more incredible tales of courage and federal justice. Until next time, keep believing in the power of constitutional truth.